I wanted to thank you, Bernie, for the invitation to come on your program. Very much appreciated, and a particular pleasure to be on with Heinrich Bruckner from the Co-op Anti-War Cafe in Berlin. We've been working with his organization as well as the Union of Political Immigrants and Political Prisoners of Ukraine to promote local actions on May 2nd of this year to commemorate the Odessa Massacre and raise the demand of the survivors and families of those who were killed for an international investigation. Einer's group in Berlin carried out two actions despite provocations by right-wingers and the police. And they were some of the largest local actions this year. So I really want to give a tip of hat to him and his comrades for the work that they've been doing in Berlin. What happened on May 2nd, 2014 was something that was called the greatest civil disturbance in Europe since World War II. And it occurred a few months after the right-wing coup that was backed by the United States that began as protests against corruption in the government, but soon morphed into a general anti-government movement in which neo-Nazi organizations quickly took the lead and played the major role in overthrowing the president, Viktor Yanukovych, who had been promoting closer economic ties with Russia, and he was replaced after an interim president by Petro Poroshenko, who wanted closer economic ties with Europe, particularly specifically the European Union. And that coup has been presented as in the West as a positive development called the Revolution of Dignity, but actually an effort by the U.S. and its European allies to bring Ukraine much closer to their own political agendas and to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Ukraine shares a 1,200-mile border with Russia, and if it were to join NATO, would significantly change the balance of forces in the region. This coup was characterized by ultranationalism, anti-ethnic Russian prejudice. People of Russian background make up about 17% of the country. About 30% of Ukraine speaks Russian as a first language. There has been a long relationship between Ukraine and Russia, but the ultranationalists who trace their political ancestry back to the anti-Soviet ultranationalist movement of the 20th century, and particularly to the fascist forces that blocked with the Nazi occupation. That's probably listeners who are going to dismiss that as some sort of pro-Russian propaganda. But the fact of the matter is you can just Google the name Stefan Bandera, the nationalist Bandera faction, who carried out a massacre of many tens of thousands of Poles in Western Ukraine to ethnically cleanse the area for the new Ukrainian state. He led pogroms against Jewish people and Ukrainian partisans, and blocked with the Nazis until they realized that what he actually wanted was an independent Ukrainian state. So they put him in prison for a while, but then they let him out to turn his forces loose on the Soviet Red Army. So his major thrust throughout his political career, Stefan Bandera, was to create a Ukrainian state that was fundamentally anti-Polish on the west and anti-Russian on the east. And he is now considered a national hero in Ukraine. And after the coup, many monuments to leaders of the Soviet military who helped, who played the leading role in driving the Nazis out of Ukraine. Those memorials have been replaced with statues to Stefan Bandera. There is an official stamp in his honor. His fascist slogan, "Glory to Ukraine," has been adopted as the official slogan of the Ukrainian military. I say all this to show that the government, which had been friendly to the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the development for the first time of Ukraine as an independent state, went through a metamorphosis after the coup. And one of the first things they did was to ban the use of Russian in official state business. Eastern Ukraine, which has a larger ethnic Russian population and has for many, since World War II, has carried out annual ceremonies marking the defeat of the Nazis and, showing respect for the Red Army and the role that it played. Felt extremely threatened. And this is what led to the peninsula of Crimea, which had been part of Russia had been part of Russia for 300 years until 1954, when it was administratively transferred to Ukraine, held a referendum and decided to rejoin Russia. And the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass region declared independence from Ukraine. And there was fighting in the port city of Mariupol, where there were separatists who decided also to break from Ukraine. In Odessa, there was no significant separatist movement, but there was an effort by progressives to try to get the law changed so that they could elect their own provincial governor, similar to what we do here in the United States. We elect the governors of the states, but in Ukraine, the local governors are selected by the federal government, which was now right-wing and anti-Russian. So they were carried out a petition campaign for the right to just elect their own governors. There was a clash between people who had supported the coup and those who had opposed the coup. And it was bolstered by thousands of right-wing soccer fans called ultras who were in town for the day. And this large mob wound up attacking the little tent city that the petitioners had set up outside the House of Trade Unions in a place called Kulikovo Square, a large public square in Odessa. And the petitioners were driven inside the building, which was then set on fire and surrounded by this mob who managed somehow to cut off the electricity and the water to the building. And at least 42 people died from the flames, from the smoke, or from jumping from the third or fourth story windows, and then being beaten to death when they hit the ground. You can find scores of cell phone videos of this attack on the internet, as well as many documentaries. And you can see the faces of the perpetrators and the fact that there were no police there intervening. And yet, to date, none of the perpetrators have been punished for their crime. And there's never been an adequate investigation. And the survivors of the massacre and the families of the victims regularly hold memorials at the site and repeat their demand for an international investigation and prosecution of those responsible. This year would have been the 8th annual memorial at the site of the massacre, but the local military administration imposed a curfew from the night before, May 2nd, to the day after, and forbid anyone to be on the street. They shut down public transportation and carried out a sweep of anyone deemed to be not sufficiently loyal to the central government. And it's been part of an escalating series of political arrests taking place across the country, oftentimes simply for someone posting something critical of the government on a blog or on social media. The numbers are up to something around 15,000 people arrested since the February 24th Russian intervention. So that's the story of May 2nd. And it's important. My wife, Anna Edwards, and I were asked to represent a coalition here in the United States called the United National Anti-War Coalition at a social forum that was held in Poland in 2016. And we met members of an organization called the Council of Mothers of May 2, who were relatives of the people killed at the House of Trade Unions. And they were holding a big memorial on May 2nd. And they were looking for people from other countries to come to Odessa as international observers because the same neo-Nazi organizations that had carried out their massacre were threatening to return to Kulikovo Square and physically attack the mourners. And they felt that if people from other countries were there, maybe that would provide some protection. Maybe the government would be reluctant to have a clash and hold back the fascists. So 3 of us from the U.S. went to Odessa, and we met with the Council of Mothers, and we went to the memorial. And on the way to the memorial in a bus with these elderly parents of the victims, we happened to stop at a red light, and there was a crowd of members of the Azov battalion who were gathered there waiting to march to the memorial. And when they realized who was in the bus, they started throwing stones at the bus and yelling and throwing a Hitler salute. That was my first introduction to Azov. And then they later marched through the memorial. But fortunately, some 3,000-4,000 people had turned out for the memorial despite the threats, and it came off very peacefully. And then since that time, when we came back, we formed the Odessa Solidarity Campaign to spread the word about the massacre and to encourage activities on every year on May 2nd. And so we've been following the situation in Ukraine about how the local chapter of Right Sector would regularly go to Kulikovo Square when the Council of Mothers would go for a monthly vigil, and they would attack them physically, and the police would stand by and do nothing. How these organizations, these neo-Nazi groups, would go to courthouses where trials were taking place that they had an interest in, and they would come in some 20, 25 strong and tell the judges what verdict they were going to come up with. And if they didn't, they threatened to burn down the building, and the judges would go along with them. How they would prevent people from having any types of progressive protests, attack lesbian and gay marches, how some of these groups would attack Roma encampments. It was just a continuing situation in which neo-Nazi organizations, most of them funded by wealthy oligarchs for their own competing political interests, had free reign in the city, in the country. I wouldn't characterize the Kiev federal government as fascist itself. It's certainly right-wing and nationalist, ultra-nationalist, but it tolerates the existence and the activities of these neo-Nazi organizations, one of which, the Azov Battalion, has been incorporated shortly after the coup into the Ukrainian National Guard and played a major role in the defense of Mariupol from the Russian troops. And they're being praised up and down by Western media for their courage and dismissing their fascist roots. The founder of the organization quoted in 2010 as saying that it is the destiny of the Ukrainian nation to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semites and the subhumans, using the German word. It's hard to find a public figure more fundamentally racist and reactionary than the founder of the Azov Battalion, who went on to be elected to the Ukrainian parliament. And we're told that, yeah, Azov has, a few hundred members, but they're not really significant and they're not typical. But That's not true. They are now the Azov regiment, which is some 2,000 members strong in the Ukrainian military, and they have regiments in all of the major cities of Ukraine. And that comes from our friends with the Union of Political Immigrants and Political Prisoners of Ukraine. So that's what we understand to be the present situation in Ukraine, which is very different than the narrative that we're being given by the mass media in the West, Western allied countries. I wanted to make three brief points and then end my presentation. I think it's extremely important to realize that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which our organization has not endorsed, but we have not condemned. We're trying to explain it. It has been going on since 2014. The war of the Ukrainian government to retake the liberated areas in the Donbas region, the People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Luhansk, has been going on since 2014. And some 15,000 people have died in that conflict. And the Ukrainian efforts to retake the area had significantly intensified in the months leading up to the Russian intervention. And that was one of the reasons that the Russians gave for the intervention. And I looked into the reports by the European Union organization.
OSCE. The OSCE.
Yes,
the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
There you go. Who we also ran into in Odessa, and they had reported that fighting had increased on both sides, but it's the major increase seemed to be coming from the Ukrainian side. When we look into these situations, we always, we listen to all sources, but we tend to quote the ones that are more quote unquote mainstream, or the ones that certainly are not considered to be partisan to the Russian side, and that seemed to be strong evidence that there was an increase in the attacks on Donbas to the point that that the leadership in the liberated territories were encouraging people who could not be combatants to leave the area before the as the fighting intensified. So that's one point. Another point is that the Russian intervention was anything but unprovoked. We're told it was just an unprovoked war of aggression and a land grab, and that is completely untrue. Back in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West wanted Germany to reunite as a country united with the capitalist West. And the leader of the Soviet Union, which was disintegrating, Mikhail Gorbachev, was opposed to that, which is understandable given Russia's experience with Germany in World War II, when the Nazis invaded and the Russian people lost 20 million of their people and 1/3 of their industrial capacity. So they weren't interested in seeing a country politically or militarily allied with the West coming out of Germany. And then Secretary of State James Baker told Gorbachev, if you agree to the reunification of Germany, we will not expand 1 inch eastward toward Russia. And Gorbachev accepted that promise. Germany was reunited. And since then, every one of the 14 countries that have joined NATO have been to the east, so that now Russia is surrounded on its western flank by NATO countries. The only ones that haven't joined yet are Ukraine, which has now in its constitution a statement that it wants to join NATO. Georgia, which has expressed an interest in joining NATO, and Finland and Sweden, which are now moving to join NATO. Russia could see what was happening. This was an incredibly hostile military expansion right up to its very borders. And once the U.S. supported the right-wing coup of 2014, it was clear that the pressure was going to increase on Russia. For what purpose? What is the game plan of the U.S. and NATO? I don't believe the United States wants to go to war with Russia. Russia has as many nuclear weapons as the United States. It would not be in their interest to go directly to war, but they would like to bring Russia, an independent country they view as an intractable competitor, they would like to bring it under its own control. And how do you do that? You go for regime change. This has been their strategy in Venezuela. This has been their strategy in Iran. It's been their strategy in Cuba. And one of the ways you promote regime change is to impose such onerous, draconian sanctions on your targeted country that the people of that country decide they've reached a point where they can't take it anymore, and they are willing to change leaders in order to try to appease the enemy. They have not been successful with that strategy in any of these countries, in any of these targeted countries, but it has created great hardship for the people of those countries. And I believe that the present situation had as its real strategy an attempt to draw Russia into a war in order to diminish its military, demoralize its people, and as an excuse to impose ever-increasing sanctions on Russia. Now, the third point I wanted to make was that this is not primarily, fundamentally, a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. The United States is supplying the military hardware and ammunition. They're supplying the military intelligence. And it is impossible to believe that the Pentagon, the most powerful military in world history, is going to leave the fate of this war, in which they have such a tremendous political stake, is going to leave it up to the Ukrainian military leaders. They are running this war. It is their strategy that is running this war, and their war propaganda that is setting the narrative. So it's not a new war. It's not an unprovoked war, and it's a proxy war. And I think that the only correct conclusion that peace activists in the West can draw should be to demand, first of all, that NATO withdraw from Eastern Europe, and that the U.S. and the Western countries stop sending military aid to Ukraine, and just back off, and it would remove all the provocations that led to the war. Russia has a right to defend itself. It has a right to react when it's put into a situation in which its very existence is at stake. Good people can argue about the wisdom of the Russian intervention, but to simply say Russia must withdraw its troop, and oh yeah, by the way, we also don't like NATO, that is, I believe, a cowardly capitulation to the war propaganda. And our responsibility as activists in the West, and particularly in the United States, is simply to condemn the role of U.S. in NATO in provoking this situation and demand that they get out. I'm going to leave it there. And thank you again, Bernie, for the opportunity to